What I want to do first of all is to introduce the concept of sustainable tourism and community development and empowerment. These elements need to be highlighted a lot more. There's a lot of discussion on this many years ago, and people almost take it for granted, and people talk about community tourism and community development and involving people, and people are important, people are the center of tourism development. In a passé way, they say it, but in actuality, they do not do what needs to happen to connect these two things. And so I want to highlight why that's so important and to provide some academic background to it as well. I taught sustainable tourism planning at UWI, at the University of the West Indies, for 8 years, so I have a bit of an academic background as well. I took what we've done in practice and translated it into academia. So there's a whole theoretical background behind all of this. It's not just the art, there's a scientific theory behind it as well. Community empowerment, empowering communities, became vogue about 20 years ago. And why was that? For lots of reasons. People felt that somehow tourism was happening almost at the expense of communities and at the expense of people. And that issues of poverty alleviation were becoming rampant. The UN was talking about, but we need to address issues of poverty. There are lots of communities that have big tourism markets. Ecotourism had been tried. It was supposed to have been the instrument or the model that dealt with poverty issues in rural communities in parts of Africa. And it was not happening. In fact, ecotourism has damaged Africa more than anything else. So by the late 1990s, the issue of poverty and empowering people, not just using them as happened in most of the national parks in Africa. And that's why when we talk about poaching in Africa, that's a whole other topic. But because people are not engaged and do not benefit from that tourism activity that's happening, they are going to fight against it, and they will constantly fight against it. You'll constantly have chaos in your tourism if you don't deal with this issue of community, of people, of empowering people within your tourism. So by the late 1990s, this issue of dealing with this problem of poverty was a big issue, and you find it a lot in the literature at that time. Then there was the role of government, that tourism could not merely be a private sector business, that governments needed to play their role and participate actively in it. And in a real way, you saw St. Lucia doing that in the late 1990s, following what was happening with the Heritage Tourism Program, which I was very much involved in. I actually conceptualized it along with my colleague Felix Finisterre. And a lot of support from the government at the time, and did what was a model to try to see how you can marry environmental protection, community empowerment, and successful tourism products. And we have lots of them. So the Fort Estate Plantation Resort is an example of a good example of something that came out of that experience. And you have a model product, top class, charging good money, and a success story. So there are lots of examples of how this thing can work. And then, of course, the private sector as partner. The private sector needs to always be a partner, and we'll talk about that as we go along, perhaps in my last slide. So there's a notion of community and tourism, the village and tourism, the town and tourism, the host community and tourism. And for the fundamental reason, and most tourism people will agree, that visitors visit a place which has people, it has communities, it has culture, it has living, it has life, and therefore you cannot have tourism outside of an existing experience, but the people make that experience. And when most of your visitors, when they speak about the experience in St. Lucia, it has a lot to do with the experience they had in the hotel, and in the hotel with the people, and even outside with the people. So a lot about the taxi drivers or the people they met on the street. The average visitor, I know, and I stay in a lot of hotels because of the kind of work I do. You walk through a corridor in a hotel, and you know whether that visitor has just landed or whether they've been there for a few days. You know the difference? After a few days, they tell you good morning. Big difference. The community, the country begins to influence how they behave and how they act. And therefore, the impact that human beings have on the visitor is extremely significant. And that's why it is so important to place that emphasis on people, on the experiences that they have. And of course, increasing recognition of the role communities play in creating and delivering tourism. We can speak about that otherwise. But there's a school of academia that supports this. It's not just something that people came up with and said, oh, this works. We've actually developed models that showed how this thing can work. And I mean, the University of the West Indies accepted the model I presented and allowed me to teach this course for 8 years. It is still taught at the University of the West Indies and taught now by my students because they recognize the importance of modeling. Tourism is not just a thing that happens. You need to model it. You need to find what are the pieces that work. How can you get these pieces to work so you can ultimately achieve what these objectives are? So As far back as 1996, Harold Goodwin, who most people who are familiar with sustainable tourism will know that name, he was actually my professor, and he says, I mean, I need to read this. He says sustainable tourism requires that a host population receives rising living standards, that the tourists and guests are satisfied with the product and continue to arrive each year. That's a powerful statement. Host and visitor have a fantastic experience, and that causes them to repeat their business and come back every time. That's what makes sustainable tourism. But he says it also requires that the natural environment is maintained for the continued enjoyment of hosts and guests. So it cannot be that you're building a tourism product and you're destroying your environmental base at the same time. There needs to be a connection between the two. Because if you look at my first slide, it was a beautiful picture of the Pitons. And therefore, if you're not going to protect that iconic image and compromise it, therefore those images that you have of what we try to sell, and Dali is going to speak about this, those things that you sell, the visitor needs to come and match that experience with what they say. And Dali will elaborate on that. So there's a mutual satisfaction of visitor and guest in that scenario. And of course, we have a talk about community tourism and things of that sort. And so Caroline Ashley, writing in the late 1990s, and a lot of the good literature on community tourism dates back there. A lot of the stuff we have now is very superficial stuff. I look at a lot of literature coming out in tourism, a lot of it is superficial. The good stuff is way back in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So Caroline Ashley, who actually coined the phrase with Harold Goodwin on pro-port tourism, which had some issues, but that's another story. She says that tourism in which local residents, often rural, poor, and marginalized people, are active participants, land managers, users, entrepreneurs, employers, decision makers, and conservators. In other words, they're at the top. They're not just benefiting. They're not just accepting what comes down. They're at the top. They're the owners. And if I may just segue quickly, I'm doing a project with the Forgelib community. What happens in the Forgelib community now is that they're being managed, only decision being made by whoever is managing their tour, and they're not managers, they're just receiving a wage. It should be the reverse. They should be the board of directors. They're the landowners. They own this site. They've been there for all their life. They need to be the landowners, and they hire somebody to manage on their behalf. And they make the decision about their product, not the reverse. And the same thing applies. That's why the issues of community tourism apply to how we do tourism across the board. The people who invest in tourism are employers, are employees of the people of St. Lucia. And therefore, they need to answer to what we dictate as the policy for development. That does not happen, does it? No. So it's about turning this whole thing on its head and thinking about community tourism in a very, very different way. So community-based tourism, which I say is not just about people in a little village or a little town doing this. It needs to apply to all tourism. It's about nation building. It's an industry which uses the community as the resource and sells it as a product, and in the process affects the lives of everyone. It can affect you negatively or positively. Most of the tourism we have today affects us negatively or not in an optimal way. And that becomes the challenge. This is a picture of a tour guide from Forgelib, and we're actually working on building their own capacity and helping them to manage their tour better down there. So going back to the literature, so what community tourism does that it shifts the focus. It shifts the focus away from the tourists and their experience to the experience of the host community. It's a shift in the focus. It has to be about that. Because without that, what you have ultimately is chaos, and you have unsustainable tourism because it implodes, it automatically implodes, and people begin to see the investors and the owners of tourism as not working in their best interest, because it becomes largely profit-driven, and it's not about people, enhancing culture, enhancing who you are, and optimizing your product. And therefore, it has to be about culturally sensitive development. It has to be about using the products and services and artistic talent that you have within your country and providing direct economic and social benefits to people. That has to be fundamental. That's what creates sustainable tourism. Nothing else. I'm sorry, nothing else. What we have going on in the Caribbean is an excuse for economic development. It is not. And I know a colleague, and I'm trying to get a copy of his study, who did a study of Jamaica, he's an economist from the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, who did a study on tourism in Jamaica and argued with actual figures and showed that Jamaica was actually subsidizing tourism development in Jamaica, that the Jamaican taxpayer was subsidizing tourism in Jamaica for big investors to make money. And I'm not sure we're too far from that in solution. And you can quote me, I don't care. So, community tourism, the challenges are, and I want to applaud the panel before, hit on some critical issues. Lack of capacity, yes. Lack of investment capital, yes. Absence of an entrepreneurial spirit is just not there. And I worked with communities in tourism for the last 20 years. It is not there. Limited self-confidence, lack of ability in themselves to do this, to actually achieve. Satisfaction to work for somebody else. You know, somebody was making a point. It was McHale. They're happy to come back and work for somebody else. And high youth employment. That characterizes the people or the people component of our tourism. And therefore, our responses to these challenges need to be a few, and I just highlight a few of them. One, every community has entrepreneurs. Every community has, ask Elevik, and he was making that point early on. Every community has entrepreneurs. We need to find them. Everybody's not a business person. We need to find those entrepreneurs because they are there. Every village has a successful artist. We need to enhance their capacity. Every rural community has responsible borrowers. Not all of them are irresponsible. A lot of them pay back their loan. In ancillary, Microfin came in to support the ancillary vendors. And the manager of Microfin at the time said that she had a it was pharmacy stores. Martin was making a point earlier on that they have a 0% of delinquency. Similar thing, the ancillary vendors had a 0% delinquency on their ancillary fish fry when they were funded by Microfin. Is how you create financing mechanisms for these people, and it can work. This nonsense about poor people cannot pay back their loans. It's not true. Elevik will tell you it's not true. My husband will tell you that too. Right. Right, exactly. So it is how you work with these small entrepreneurs and work with them. Every town has professionals. Use them to provide corporate guidance. They can do that. They can provide this overall corporate guidance. Every community has youth. We need to invest in their creative talents unquestionably. And I say this again without any beat, because that is critical. We need to invest in youth and build the talent that they have. A lot of old people talking to young people, telling them that crap. These young people will tell you what they want, what they can do, and how they can do it, and it can work. Trust me, it will work. We need to invest in them and make these things happen. I want to thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations.